Hello, how are you?
Hi Tamás, szia Tamás.
Hi Attila.
How is everything?
Yeah, great. We are excited.
Okay, that's good. At least one person is excited.
I will ask
At least two.
also if Fábio can come to the camera, so we make this test before starting.
My other device did not work, so I had to switch devices.
Attila, I have already uploaded your presentation. So
The very last one, I hope, Karina.
I think I'll put my phones also. So we have
Hello, Karina. Can you see me now?
Hi.
Hi, Tamás. Hi, Attila.
Hi.
Very happy to meet you. I read your text, Tamás. I found it just so good and so enlightening. Thank you for sharing. Happy to meet you. I read your text.
Yeah, I'll make a short summary of it, and I also read your paper, and I'm also very excited to see the parallels and see this whole thing a little bit from a global structural perspective as well.
The text that I sent you is not really a paper. I can send you papers later on. That was just a short note that was published in several English-speaking outlets when Bolsonaro was elected. Like there was a few different outlets asking me for a text. So that is not a. But then I have some more developed text that I can share with you later if you're interested.
Yeah, I would appreciate. I saw you published maybe part of it at the Bazooka News, the South African.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I did.
I don't know if I can download it from there though, so maybe if you share it with me, I would really appreciate.
Sure.
Yes, with everything. Yes.
Okay, so I think we can wait more 5 minutes for people to come, and then I will make a brief introduction and explain how will be the dynamic of our meeting. We are already online on Facebook on the page of the Fontié Forum, which we will send all the links on the chat on your left. And I think the only rule we have to pay attention is to turn off the audio when somebody is speaking. Yeah, turn off the microphone.
Karina, can you just tell me? I just want to make a quick test.
Okay.
Can you see me well now?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay.
Are you going to use some PDF?
Oh, I didn't really have the time to prepare a PDF.
I know. So maybe we can share like.
I'm glad I was able to prepare anything at all. Someone invited me 2 days ago.
That's true.
It's not because this is the pandemic that we are not doing anything.
That's it. The Workers' Day. We are working.
Yeah. So no, I don't have I can share what text that I have, but I don't have a presentation, a proper PDF.
That's good. I think if there are materials to share, we can prepare the email with the people that are attending the event, and then we can share more and create a network.
I try to see Attila. I think he's talking to somebody else, but I try to see the interview with Attila on Tariq Ali, but the audio is not working. I don't know what happened. Really? Yes, every other video in Telesur and with Tariq Ali, the audio is fine. And I tried on 2 different devices, so the problem is not with my devices. I don't know what happened. The audio is not going. Perhaps you can try later, Karina, and see if you can listen on your computer. But I tried on 2 devices, and so I was only able to read the text that you shared, which were great. Also, Attila's text, very good.
Yeah. For me, the video,
to see that interview.
Yes, I can share also the links on the chat so everybody can have access. Because for me, the YouTube interview from Tariq Ali with Attila was working pretty well.
You try now?
No, but yesterday and the other days, it's good.
Okay.
Attila, do you
Then
have...
to sit here, right?
Maybe.
Okay. So I think it's already 3. Maybe I can welcome. I would like to nominate our friends and students and professors that are online right now with us. So I welcome Antônio Rodrigues, Claudete Pagotto, Danilo Chaves Nakamura, Eduardo Santos, Fábio Luiz, which is our special guest also, Fátima Chaves, German Raul Chaparro, Gabor Bachi, I'm sorry if I did not the right way to say, but Patricia, Villen, and Bruno, the professors from Unicamp, Bruno from Unicamp and Patricia that helped us to also organize this dialogue, this web conversation today. And there is TK, I don't know which exactly who is, and Vera Teles, the professor that is also one of the coordinators of our international forum, Fontié e Kwze, Fronteiras Cruzadas, and there is also Zoltan Guinelli that is already online. So I think we can start now, right? It's already 3 o'clock. So I will ask again if I'm going to make this brief introduction. If you can turn off the microphones, everybody, and also the audience, please, so we can guarantee that the quality is good for everyone. So I would like to say hello again and welcome everybody. Good afternoon and good night for those who are in other GMT time schedules. I am Karina Quintanilha, and I will be the moderator of this web conversation with Daniel Perseguin. We are thrilled to be with you all connected, and especially between the hubs from Budapest, São Paulo, and New York, with very special guests, Attila Melegh, Geröcs Tamás, and Fábio Luiz Barbosa. In this 1st of May, the Workers' Day, we are facing one of the biggest challenges with a global pandemic crisis hitting our countries and producing drastic political economic consequences. Stimulated by this potential to connect with people that are interested to overcome these challenges, I am really happy to announce that we are inaugurating a series of online meetings, the Fontié Forum Web Conversations, as part of the 3rd Fontié e Kwze Forum, Crossed Borders, Contemporary Migration, and Social Transformations. It means it is the beginning of the 3rd Fontié e Kwze Forum that is supported by the School of Communication and Arts of the University of São Paulo and the Brazilian Federal Agency for Support and Evaluation of Graduate Education, CAPES. It is the first time we are organizing online conference, so please be patient and we hope you enjoy. The International Forum, Fontié e Kwze, Borders Crossed, is an interdisciplinary academic, social, and artistic initiative based in the University of São Paulo, understanding the phenomenon of mass migration in the 21st century as a transversal reality that crosses the most different areas of knowledge and living in society. We seek to contribute to scientific and technological advances on these studies, and at the same time contribute to a social-technical network engaged with immigrants and refugees workers using the university as a platform. Our proposal is that while the coronavirus pandemic lasts, to use the online academic platform to enhance international dialogues in a critical and humanistic perspective at the intersection of research, activism, and culture. Do you want to present it? We are doing it through the conference web, a system supported by the Rede Nacional de Ensino e Pesquisa, which is National Education and Research Network. RNP, qualified as a social organization, is related to the Ministry of Science, Technology, Innovations and Communications, and maintained jointly by the Ministries of Education, Culture, Health, and Defense, who participate in the inter-ministry program of RNP. I think we have more people joining us right now. Let me check here. Just a minute. Just a minute. Acho que eu acho aqui. Aqui. No. Okay, I think we have more people from other countries join us. We would like to encourage everybody to use freely the chat to present yourselves and to leave comments and questions so we can establish a live network during this event. The chat window is located on the left side of your screen. So today we will have the honor of having 2 international presentations from Hungary and 1 speaker from Brazil to debate global crisis, dependent capitalism, and social control. Just for a quick brief before presenting our guests, as moderators, me and Daniel, we have elaborated 3 questions to help guiding our discussions. We ask, how can we transcend the boundaries of capitalist oppressions and social control to illuminate the complex social, political, economic, and sanitary crisis we face today in? And second question, what are the particularities we are facing within the rising of the extreme right in Eastern Europe and Latin America? And what are the impacts for the working class and specific for migrant workers in these regions? What are the current conditions for social transformation? The big question. So to debate today, we will have the presentation of Attila Melegh, a sociologist and historian. He's associate professor at Corvinus University, Budapest. He has taught in the United States, Russia, Georgia, and Hungary. He's associate professor at Corvinus University, Budapest, and a senior researcher at the Demographic Research Institute. His research focuses on the global history of social change in the 20th century and international migration. Author of the book On the East-West Slope, Globalization, Nationalism, Racism, and Discourses on Central Eastern Europe, published at CEU Press. He is the founding director of Karl Polanyi Research Center at Corvinus University. I also would like to mention that Attila has several videos online that we will also put here on this chat. And he has recently published a paper translated to Portuguese on the magazine called Lutas Sociais, like social struggles. And I have also the pleasure to present Geröcs Tamás, which is a research fellow at the Institute of Road Economics, Hungarian Academy of Science. He graduated from the Corvinus University of Budapest in 2008 with his major in international relations. Geröcs is currently working on his PhD at the State University of New York in Birmingham. His research field of interest is Eastern Europe with a special regard for economic transformation in Hungary and other post-socialist countries, theoretical questions on global and historical unequal development, semi-peripheral dependent development with respect to external financial dependence, vertical specialization in the regional automotive value chains. Geröcs is also a member of the Budapest-based Working Group for Public Sociology, Kwze. And we will also have the presentation as a speaker, Fábio Luiz Barbosa, which is Professor of Latin America Studies in the Federal University of São Paulo, Unifesp. He's the author of the book, Power and Impotence, A History of South America Under Progressivism between 1998 and 2016, among other books. So just to share the dynamic for today, I remember that we will have from 20 to 25 minutes for each presentation. And I will ask that any question or comment you have from the audience, please send via chat. And we will, after all the presentation, we will try to open a last round for our guest speakers to around 5 minutes each in dialogue with the audience, questions and comments. And I also remember that we will issue a certificate of participation for everybody that is interested. So please write an email for our organization. It's Fontié Forum, which we will put on the chat too. And now I welcome Professor Attila to start your presentation. And I thank everybody that is also attending this event.
Well, okay. Can you hear me now? Good. So, welcome everybody. No. Okay. Can you hear me now? Good. So, welcome everybody. No. Yeah. So, welcome everybody in this very important discussion we are having today with such distinguished people like the other presenters. And we have already got 3 major questions. But as a Marxist scholar, I would like to go a little bit deeper. I would like to go into global social development, and I would like to give you a specific analysis of this new authoritarian right, why this authoritarian right is rising. I would like to give one background of that which we can call political demography. So I'm going to speak about political demography. I'm going to speak about what is the situation of humanity and its development in this current era of a globalization cycle, at the end of a big opening up cycle, and why these contradictions, which we can see here, or we will see hopefully, is partially an explanation for the developments today. On purpose, on the first slide, I put 3 photos which I absolutely related to our pandemic life as well. On the left side, you can see an elderly man, and I'm going to speak a lot about the aging of humanity, which is a huge social process. We have to pay attention to that. The second picture in the middle, these are migrant workers having masks on themselves, and I'm going to speak about why migration is such a crucial issue in this era of political demography. And of course, the very last thing, which is super important, is the healthcare. So the healthcare work. I hope you can still hear me, right? Good. Can we go to the next slide, or how do I switch? I switch. Okay, just a second. If it switches, but this is very slow, so I'm trying to. Okay, I can't. It's better. Okay. Just a second. The slide is not coming up. Yes. So in specific, I'm going to speak about aging and the decline of fertility. I will speak about the rising health costs. I will speak quite a lot about the problem of redistribution. I will also refer to the collapse of rural societies globally. And then, of course, I will speak about labor. This is May the 1st. This is Labor Day. We have to talk a lot about it. Now, here is the first slide, as you can see. This first slide shows you just very briefly three very important developments. Humanity is still increasing in number, but migration in this era of globalization is actually increasing faster than humanity is increasing. Also, very importantly, mortality is improving, while at the same time we have an amazingly big story of humanity. Humanity is taking fertility under complete control. At the next slide, I'm going to speak about one thing. I am trying to save time now because the computer switches the slides very slowly. So I have to maneuver between different devices now. So the slide which is coming up shows you line, and there is hopefully it's a kind of a blue or black kind of a line. I don't see it properly. And then you can see that the old age dependency in humanity is increasing rather rapidly. That is to say, it is, what is old age dependency? Old age dependency is the ratio between people above the age of 65 and people of working age. Now, this is an aging process because we are after a very important period when actually this ratio was improving. Up to the 1980s, in most of the world, it was improving. Today, it is improving only in one continent, namely Africa. It's stopping at the moment in Latin America, and only Africa remains very actually more improving. The other line you can see, it shows redistribution levels globally.
Just
you can measure this as a percentage of tax revenue.
I will ask.
I'm listening, Karina.
I will ask everybody to turn off the camera so we can have better quality of your speech. Okay, so everybody turn off the camera so we can. I will also turn off my camera. think it will be better quality and faster.
Okay.
Thank you.
Can I continue?
You can keep. Yeah, please.
Okay, I am continuing then. So then you can see the other line, which is the tax revenue as related to GDP, meaning what is the percentage of the tax revenue generated in all economies globally. And there you can see that this redistribution level is rather stable. During the neoliberal period, it actually declined, and this decline shows that while at the moment more and more people need social services because of aging, at the same time tax revenues are not increasing in terms of proportion. Now we can go to the next slide. And the next slide is going to show, and I immediately would like to make a link to this authoritarian thing. There you can see two good friends. One is Viktor Orban and the other one is Bolsonaro. They like each other very much publicly, and there are some very important common elements we can talk about. In Brazil, as far as we go back to 2017, public expenditure is completely frozen for 20 years, regardless of change in GDP or in population or in problems. Even today's pandemic cannot be an excuse for the increase of redistribution levels in an absolute term. Viktor Orban is also very much in the news, in international news, because he is seen, for instance, attacking academics. One thing which people don't pay attention to is that behind this attack on academics, behind the political reasons, there are very important economic reasons. Viktor Orban has made a long-term promise of reducing public employment, of reducing public expenditure in various spheres of society. Even today, there's a lot of controversy around the pandemic, whether actually he wants to decrease the number of hospital beds and so on, so to reduce costs. Now, in case we go to the next slide, and of course, only the middle class is receiving extra benefits. Now let's go to the next slide. I hope it is. This computer is very slow, but it's coming up. Just a second. There you can see, once again, two lines. During the era of globalization, you can see the red line. There has been a dramatic global increase of GDP per capita. It is a base index. It shows that if we take 2000 as 100%, then we can see that even after 2000, the GDP per capita, globally speaking, of course with a lot of inequality, has increased, more than doubled. But what is more rapid in increase is actually the change of per capita health expenditure, which means that societies globally are increasing per capita health expenditure even more rapidly than the economy is growing. Why is it so important? I regard this fact very important in the current situation of global development, because we have to consider historical change here. how people can cover health expenditure, how this aging can be covered socially, that is to say, how the elderly people can be taken care of in this development. Because by the 1980s, we actually, as Eric Hobsbawm, the very famous Marxist historian, put it, globally, peasantry died. We are seeing the disappearance of peasant societies, which is important in terms of the social services, because peasant societies are the ones which are doing self-subsistence in terms of taking care of the elderly and also of the sick within a family or household economy. As soon as peasantry is out of this social model, then basically we have only two ways to cover the expenditure and the need for services. One is through the market, the other is through the state. Of course, globally speaking, there is a dramatic difference how much state involvement we have in society. This level in Brazil is around 12% today in terms of tax revenues. In Hungary, it is around 24%, which is the double. But still, the thing is, what I would like to draw your attention to is that societies are aging. More and more need is to be, more and more attention and more services and money is to be spent on this aging population in terms of health, in terms of social services. Nonetheless, people have to compete very severely with each other in order to satisfy these needs. They can do it either through the market or they can do it either through the state. I think this is going to be the big thing for the coming decades. Now, I mentioned already how migration is important in this development, because my other argument is that beside this dramatic change in humanity, migration is really at the crux of the contradictions. This can be seen here as well, because aging and marketization of society is basically how we can marketize care work. Who are the best care workers throughout globally? Of course, the migrant care workers, because they cost less in the receiving societies, which means that more and more we see pictures like this. Migrants are taking care of these elderly throughout the world. So care work is in the tension point. Now, let's go to some other basic facts which we need to talk about. Capitalism is doing an enormous exploitation to labor. Capitalism is also very interesting in the sense that with its technology, it is able to produce a dramatic amount of products, and as I showed you, there is economic growth. But in this economic growth now, there is a declining labor force participation rate in the working age groups. This is due to several reasons, including schooling. Schooling is going up all around the world, but still that is not an explanation that there is a decline of labor force participation rates. There is even a more shocking picture, which I'm going to show you immediately. In case you look at what percentage of the labor revenue is showing within the economy, then what you can see here that in the era of globalization, actually it was a very stable figure for 100 years. Now in this era, this neoliberal era, we see that the share of the labor revenue within the economy is going down, which means that labor is becoming less and less significant in this economic development with all its consequences. And now we come, and I apologize for this, we come to a rather complicated graph, but let me explain it. So try to listen to me now. We see at the moment, that is the argument I have, the spread of authoritarian right is in an era globally. And one important thing why we need to do it globally. We need to do it globally because it's a global change. There's not only one Bolsonaro, one Orban, one Putin, but there is also Modi. There is also the Japanese political system. There is Turkey. There is the United States of America. So we can see it's a global trend. Why is it so? I think this is due to the combination of three factors. And this is what I try to show you. One is that in the 1990s, from the 1980s, we have been living in an era of an opening up economy. This is what we call globalization, meaning that products, commercial activity, the movement of capital, to a very large extent also the movement of labor, all things were growing up rather dramatically. Now, with the crisis in 2008 in the West, later in Brazil it came later, I know it came a little bit later, in the 2010s, this opening up is stopping. It is at least stagnating, but in case we look at even foreign direct investment and various ways how we can measure the movement of capital, all these things are slowing down. Economies are closing down. At the same time, and I made a rough indicator of labor market tensions because of the declining labor force participation rate, because of the loss of primary jobs in agriculture and in industry, everybody moving towards service industry, plus other factors which I've already mentioned. You can see this line, this is this line in the negative, you can see it is increasing. So labor tension is going up, but at the same time, globalization is actually also, so we are more and more in closed economies or less open economies, more and more labor conflicts, while at the same time, and this is the last point, we see that this need for extra social services, how to take care of the people, is actually going up. Now let's make the story even more concrete. And now I come to the next part of my talk, where once again I'm going to show you, don't be frightened, some graphs. But these graphs are just helping us, and in the end you will see the argument. So the neoliberal era has made, and this is the second part of my argument, has made migration as the crux of the tensions. Why I am saying that this is the result of neoliberal development. This is the result of neoliberal development because very clearly, globally, and I checked it for more than 40 countries already, foreign direct investments, that is to say, the movement of capital globally, the free movement of capital, leads to higher and higher level of emigration in those countries where it goes into, in case it finds some non-capitalist parts or it finds some traditional structures. Meaning that actually this freedom of capital led to a higher level of migration, which is, as I will show it later, is perceived negatively in so many societies today. And once again, the next two graphs, I hope they are not too complicated for you. Once again, try to listen to me. Maybe I have I have created two complicated ones. Now this is Eastern European story. Basically, don't look at the beautiful colors. They are really nice. I like that it's very lively how it looks like. But the point I would like to make, I'm showing to you something. Here, this is the global development, right? Meaning, this is the global development of foreign direct investment and migration. Meaning that there is a slight increase of migration due to foreign direct investment changes 10 years earlier, because the movement of capital leads to further migration with a time gap. What is the East European story? Now, the East European story is really dramatic. Eastern Europe, by all standards, is more open in terms of economies than any other part of the world. It is more open in terms of foreign direct investment. Almost all countries are above global average. Not only that, here the increase of migration has been rather steep, rather harsh. These societies are extremely open in terms of out-migration. And why is it such a big problem? Because this is all happening, this is what capital is doing to us. This is all happening in a region which is struggling with dramatic demographic decline. This region is losing population. It's not only just aging, but it's population. These regions, why is it so important? It is so important. It was actually the background why some of these authoritarian politicians like Viktor Orban could make a big case out of with regard to this demographic nationalism. He is arguing that these cultures, these languages are disappearing. We have to stop it. We have to turn back a little bit globalization in that sense, because we cannot lose that amount of population. In one sense, we have to agree, because at the moment, in case these demographic processes are happening, nobody is going to be able to provide the care for the elderly and the sick. So for instance, in a country like Bulgaria, in 50 years' time, there is going to be, the labor force is going to be equal to the total amount of elderly dependent people. 1 to 1. Which means that that social service system cannot be maintained. That is one of the reasons why we have to see how these regions are different, but at the same time the same global story. Now I would like to show you a little bit, the next slide is Latin America. It's not complete, certain countries are missing out of that, but here, once again, I would like to show you that this is the word, sorry, I'm just, here it is. So this is the global average. Then you can see that Latin America is very much like Eastern Europe in a lot of ways. I can tell you these two regions are very close in developmental patterns. Asia is different. Africa is also different. I've already checked it in all different ways. And of course, Western Europe is different in a lot of ways. And North America. Here what we can see that actually the foreign direct investment openness of these economies is lower. In the case of this, it's a huge country, and huge countries have generally lower levels in this respect. But once again, the story is there. Foreign direct investment, opening up of the economies, pushing up out migration. Latin America is sending more and more migrants out of itself. And also creating new tensions. Most importantly, it is creating new tensions because North America is turning very anti-migrant. which means that it's causing a lot of troubles in this kind of a migration system. Nonetheless, one more thing which I would like to mention is that Latin America is very similar to Eastern Europe because it is not taking migrants from outside the region, but Latin America is a little bit luckier in the sense, in case we can say that, luckier in the sense that it is aging, the fertility is going down, but it started later, and actually the levels are not so high as in Eastern Europe in that respect as well. So the demographic emptying of Latin America is not happening now. And now, very quickly, I hope still I have some time to finish. I would like to go back to the politics. So what is happening? Why migration has become the big topic of this current era? Beyond, of course, now, but we can talk about this later. So the migrants are caught in this tension, and this is due to the marketization of societies. So they are going to be in that. Why is it so? First, the relative ratio is going up. Also, very importantly, we talked a little about this, they are also fleeing because of wars in very large numbers. Also, very importantly, the number of emigrant countries has gone up dramatically. The number of immigrant countries has not changed. So there is a dramatic bottleneck effect. And even these migrants are competing with each other. The next thing, within this era of market and state and no other social systems, these migrants are seen as competitors by those societies which are receiving them. But at the same time, and this is something very important, they are needy. So they are hated and needed at the same time. And even we can say that neoliberal economic policy has been promoting migration. And then this became the big issue of these anti-migrant populists like Viktor Orban. Now, once again, just very quickly, before we go on, I'll show you the next slide. How important migrants are, you can see it in this era of coronavirus. I just want to draw your attention to this dramatic social conflict emerging because of the pandemic. I just wanted to show you two Romanian scandals in Eastern Europe. One is that German farmers made it very clear that they needed workers desperately, because in case they cannot collect sparga, then it's going to be a big problem for them. So 1,500 people in this epidemic was taken without any social distancing. You can see the picture. Without any social distancing. Without any medical, were taken to Germany to work. And the other scandal, I just took it the last week. I'm just talking about the last week. And then there you can see that these are slaughterhouses in Germany. And in the slaughterhouses, these Romanian workers who keep on working, of course, how massively they get coronavirus, how many of them become sick and disadvantaged, once again in this. So the point is the following, that there has been globalization, the freedom of movement of capital was followed by a promotion of migration. This led to social conflicts, and now the anti-migrant populists are trying to go against migration, not against the mobility of labor. So there is some kind of a huge contradiction is going on. One more thing I would like to mention very importantly. It's not only that there is xenophobia in a lot of economies, but migrants themselves are also more and more oriented toward social and welfare services, in the sense not taking away immediately from people, but for that elderly period. In case you interview migrants, why are you going to Austria and trying? Oh, I would like to get some pension in Austria working there. Why do you come to Eastern Europe, for instance? And then the answer very often of these migrants is that I am accumulating money for schooling, I'm accumulating money for healthcare, I'm accumulating money for my elderly period. We know from Gallup that migrants, the potential of migration is there's only one real relationship. In case local people see that local state not providing services, it pushes up the intention of migration dramatically. Not income is the key factor. This is the key factor in case you read this carefully. And now I have only two more things to show to you. And then I am finished. Here I made just a very brief overview on the basis of World Value Survey. Which are the countries where anti-migrant feelings were going up as compared between 1980 and the 2010s. And then you can see that basically the left part of the slide, you can see these are the ones who are actually the countries where anti-migrant feelings are going up rather dramatically. There you can see, you know, very neoliberal big countries like India. You can listen to the anti-Muslim law now introduced in Modi's India, right? I just want to draw your attention. Very importantly, South Korea, Turkey. Turkey is a very neoliberal economy, and this is, and there you can see that regardless of the saying that Syrian refugees could stay there, anti-migrant feelings are going up. Also, very importantly, we have the classic Western countries. So we see, the classic ones. But very importantly, there are the ones of Eastern Europe. Now, on the right side, you can see the ones where it is not increasing, it is not changing, and it's also very important. It's related to Latin America also, but even Latin America is changing now. We know it that during the last 2-3 years, the figures in Chile, in Brazil, are actually worse and worse. Now, the point what I would like to make is that in case that you see that there is a big animosity against migrants, these are very authoritarian countries. So, look, Azerbaijan, Belarus, then you see Russia, and so on and so on, Hungary. All these countries are at the same time authoritarian. So here is my point. Humanity is going through a dramatic change in which migration is playing a very important role for various reasons. Social tensions are increasing, and migration is the kind of the key point. And here is the conclusion. The conclusion I would like to make, and I have to admit, I have 2 more slides which I'm not showing to you now. I made a comparative analysis of Brazil and Hungary. In case we have time, I come back to this, but not now. So how I can sum up the story I was trying to make. As we all knew from Karl Polanyi as well, marketization in the neoliberal era, and very importantly, in the current demographic development, is creating massive tensions. A massive welfare competition, a massive tension. We are seeing the final collapse of peasant societies globally. We are also seeing that people are more and more dependent on state and the market, and very importantly, we are at the point when there are no other institutions left. Now, Karl Marx is more relevant than ever. We have a totalized global market without additional social systems. Only the state redistribution exists against the market. The market has been totalized. The market has uprooted people through migration, and migrants can become really the issue of this rising authoritarianism. And then, very importantly, opening up to marketization and this is the final conclusion, and I hope that I showed you the mechanism, that the increase of marketization, the increase of the freedom of global capital leads to authoritarianism if political conditions are ripe in the countries. What is the thing, what we can do? That was the other big questions. I can only share this kind of a photos, like in Brazil. I think this is the point that there is no possibility of a peasant-type self-exploitation. We have to stand up for our rights. We have to go against the market, and we have to capture the state in order to protect our life, which is becoming longer, but unfortunately, from a social and healthcare point of view, more and more problematic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Attila, for your amazing presentation. So I am Daniel Perseguin. I'm also a moderator of Webconversation with Karina Quintanilha. We are doing this conference on the 1st of May, the Workers' Day. So that's a very important issue. The Webconversation is a series of online meetings from the Fontié Forum. We are an international forum that is supported by the School of Communication and Arts of the University of São Paulo, USP, and by the Brazilian Federal Agency for Support and Evaluation of Graduate Education, CAPES. So this is our first web conference. Following Attila Melegh, we'll talk with Geröcs Tamás, who is online. I would ask him for turning on his camera and microphone too.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Okay.
Since we are all in different time zones, I think it's really the best way to greet everyone is to wish a happy and productive Workers' Day, which is still applies to everywhere, whether you are in Brazil, Eastern Europe, or in the North. Shall I start now? Is it?
Yes, I will introduce you, but you can start the presentation now. Thank you, Tamás.
Okay, so let me start with that. The presentation I do is based on more a political economy approach, international political economy approach. I'm presenting this little work also on behalf of my fellow friends and comrades, mostly based in Budapest, Hungary, the Working Group for Public Sociology, Kwze, and this particular paper was written by a good friend and colleague of mine, Ágnes Gagyi, and myself. If you're interested, so the draft is out. I don't know if it has been distributed or available to you. I'll make a brief summary here. So please, the next slide. So a little bit about the framework of the political economy we use here, and then I try to apply it into the case of Hungary to show how we try to reconstruct this shift to what is called the new authoritarian regime in Hungary, to draw some parallels and maybe distinctions to other regions in the global East and South. So this framework we use is very much rooted in both the Latin American dependency theory, which highlights how internal social dynamics are actually related to the external environment. So the world economic global changes are not separate from the processes you encounter inside a particular state or a particular region, but there is a connection here. Other traditions we combine the dependency theory with is something like the neo-Gramscian theory of state and class relations that raises questions of what is the state, what sort of a class composition various states have, Both in the north, this school following Nicholas Poulentis, of course, focused on the UK and Western European countries, but we would try to apply it more to semi-peripheral contexts. So what kind of a class composition and what kind of a state you have in the global south and in the global east. We also put this whole thing into a larger framework, which we call like the world systems theory, this historical sociology that was coming from the US, but also from other countries, to put it into a full global picture. This is maybe as an introduction, like the kind of approach we try to use here. And I will rather emphasize the neo-Gramscian language. So we're going to talk about various forms of hegemony, a type of a global hegemony, but also changing, shifting hegemonies in a more localized regional context in the semi-periphery. And I'll also talk about a regime of accumulation, which here I associate with this question of what kind of a relationship there is between the state and actually the dominant classes, the kind of a power block here. So what this story is about, and thank you for the next slide, is of course I draw up a very broad picture, and there's not much time to go into every details here. So we use the theory of a shift in the global hegemonic system that occurred from the 1970s onwards, and we encounter a sign of a declining of a previous hegemonic regime, which was very much dominated by post-war US Fordism and of course militarism globally, put it into a Cold War context, into something that is a more multipolar and contented period of whether it's a post-hegemonic or still a decline of hegemony or a transition to a new hegemony is a big question. Look at these processes from a semi-peripheral point of view, and here I really rely on the dependency theory, the classical dependency theory. What I mean by semi-periphery is a kind of a form of the integration into the global system, and through this integration, various economic dependencies are actually produced and reproduced. I would use the term reproduced because this is a long historical process, a kind of a long period process, how by shifting hegemonies and new regimes of accumulation, these economic dependencies are reformulated and reconfigured as new dependencies. So as of the dependency school definition, we rely on financial dependencies, how like there is a need for capital import, and how there is a kind of a technological dependency or technological import dependency in the semi-periphery. Please, next slide. And of course, this is the kind of external aspect here, right? But as I promised you, we need to talk about the connection between the external and the internal aspects. And of course, it's very important to see what the kind of internal class structures you might encounter in the various forms of semi-peripheral development. Still, what I'm saying is a methodological question, if you like, transhistorical in that sense. So in order to understand it better, of course, you have to go to the concrete historical context to see how these relations occur. And hopefully I'll keep my presentation focusing on these historical particularities. As of these internal dynamics, as you can see on the slides, what we usually see is there's a highly fragmented and contested, if you like, fragile power block in the semi-periphery. There are various ways to understand this internal fragmentation. The way we understand here is whether it's more allied to international capital, or whether it's a kind of a national bourgeoisie, if I may use this concept, which is more inclined to protect itself from the global capitalist tensions. So there is a tensions between these groups, its compradors, and the kind of a national capitalist classes. but it doesn't mean there is a full antagonism. It's still a power block. They are all form of junior partners of the large global hegemonic capital, but there is a competitions amongst them within the power block, and as the global hegemonic composition changes, their relations changes as well. This is, of course, focusing on capital and intercapitalist relations. We should never forget how it relates to other social dynamics outside of the power block, which is, of course, reflecting on dominated classes, as I put it into the question of labor. Usually, it's also a very highly fragmented group of people. And we see various forms of domination, exploitation, and the fragmentation of the workforce on behalf of the actual historical power block. In this presentation, I will focus more on the reconfiguration of the power block and the ways they implement their policies of domination. What is a little bit sidelined here, but my colleagues in the Working Group for Public Sociology have already done extensive studies, is of course questions of the class struggle, questions of social dynamics among laborers, and also questions of the ideological elements of domination. I will not have too much time and space to talk about these aspects here, but I'll try to highlight them a little bit. So please, next slide. I think this was the kind of introduction of the methodology, if you like, and as I promised, in order to better understand these processes, you have to go from the very abstract, trans-historical, schematic framework into a concrete historical analysis. So I'm very briefly trying to use these concepts for a historical analysis, focusing on Hungary in particular, but as I hope some of the conclusions and repercussions can be useful as of the global semi-periphery. So Hungary's integration into the capitalist world system, or reintegration to the capitalist world system, was really enhanced and deepened from the 1970s onwards, which is a major turning point in the history of global hegemony. And to understand it, this kind of historical context, we can draw a lot of parallels with developments actually in Latin America, which I would call that form of an import substitutional industrialization project was put in practice. This we call in Hungary a breach position, which was a kind of a trade relationship between Western, mostly German and American economies to import technology and to resell it in the Comecon, the Soviet economic sphere. It was a very peculiar form of trade specialization, heavily relied on actually Western trade and Western capital flows. And one of the principles of this form of integration was very briefly to highlight kind of terms of trade between the West and the East, between the Comecon and Western Europe. These terms of trade functioned relatively efficiently until the late 1970s, but for various reasons, we encountered a massive shift in the late 1970s, which put this breach position in a very unfavorable situation in terms of its ability to access global capital and to sustain its form of industrialization model, import substitutional industrialization model. Please, next slide. So what happens? This is just an illustration of an empirical illustration of the changes in the terms of trade that you can see occurred in the mid-late 1970s. It actually deteriorated in both directions, to the socialist Comecon direction as well as to the Western non-socialist trade directions as well. And in an accumulative form, you see that from around 1975, it's been constantly deteriorating, which is, I'll come back to this. It's a very interesting thing to encounter because, for example, the 1990s and the whole political regime change could not could not change the direction of the kind of trade relations of the country. Next slide, please. So already in the 1980s and much later on the 1990s, what we see is the exhaustion of this, some people would claim, state capitalist model and the kind of modernization effort of the import substitution industrialization, and it pushed these economies to rely more and more heavily on external finances, financial resources, which they could access in the form of international loans. There are various reasons how these loans were distributed and what were the international context of, for example, the petrodollars and the oil price shocks of the 1970s. I cannot go into the details of that. What we need to see here is that from the 1970s onwards, in order to sustain this model and to sustain the reproduction of its social basis, there was a ever-increasing reliance of international loans, which led to a very strong financial dependence by the middle of the 1980s and the late 1980s. It strangely also led to the exhaustion of international resources in the forms of domestic investments, and there was a series of debt crises in Eastern Europe in the 1980s, again, similar to the Latin American experience. Hungary joined the IMF in 1982, despite the fact it was still a socialist country, which was officially not adopting two capitalist monetary systems, but it had to become an IMF member in order to access bailouts. We see various forms of capital entering into the economy. So in this period, from the 1970s and 80s onwards, the dominant form of international capital was international loans. But from the 90s onwards, and please switch to the next slide, what we see is that there's a rise of foreign direct investment entering into the economy. Of course, it's very important what Professor Attila explained about the role of foreign direct investments in the whole composition of the political landscape and the social landscape of a particular country. As of the political economic aspects of it, what I would highlight is that much of the FDI entered into these economies, into the Hungarian economy, through privatizations. So it was a kind of a bargaining between international capital and the various domestic capitalist classes in somewhat unfavorable conditions. So we encountered, fire sale privatizations, the kind of demolishing of the productive capacity that was built up during the import substitutional industrialization, and much of the domestic capitalist classes experienced a form of subjugations to international capital. They managed to protect themselves in various targeted spheres of the economy, mostly in domestic service economies. But what occurred with the productive basis was, of course, that something like the maquiladoras in Mexico, large export industries were implemented by multinational capitals, and the country was fully reintegrated into international manufacturing value chains, mostly German automobile and electronic value chains. Of course, it had a massive impact on labor relations in the country. We call this period as a new form of a neoliberal accumulation regime, which created a large industrial reserve army. So most people lost their jobs during the regime change. There was a high informalization of the economy and the high fragmentation of the labor force. And one reason why we didn't see a very massive labor resistance to capital was that actually even the domestic capitalist classes became subjugated. So politically, under this neoliberal accumulation regime, fractions of the labor force actually allied with fractions of the domestic capitalist classes in this renegotiation of international versus domestic capital relations. Next slide, please. I know I'm very quick and schematic because this is a large historical perspective that I'm describing here, and there are a lot of important details here which I cannot go into, unfortunately, but you can find it in the paper, or we can discuss various aspects in the Q&A section. What I want to highlight here is the immediate prelude to the so-called authoritarian shift to Orban regime, which was the exhaustion of this previous neoliberal accumulation regime, kind of a decline, or in fact a collapse of this temporary power block that was built under the neoliberal accumulation regime in the 1990s, that was heavily based on form of a comprador capitalist alliance, relying and depending on international capital, FDI, coming in. The way it was exhausted was again manifold. What happened in a nutshell was that privatization ended and multinational companies managed to control most sectors of the economy. They, through various forms of liberalization and deregulations, they were able to repatriate the income they produced in the factory in forms of profit, transfer pricing, royalty rights. So less and less capital came in, and more capital left the country. So actually the country became a net exporter of capital as the reoccurrence of financial dependency, and it again led to a massive problem in the balance of payments. To make the situation worse, much of the debt that entered into the country parallel to FDI went into the private sphere, went into households in the form of, for example, mortgage debt. So the kind of a default that occurred in the early 2000s was not necessarily a state type of a default, as happened in the 1980s. Private households defaulted, and we had a massive decline of what we might call the middle class based on mortgage and debt accumulation. So next slide, please. Again, this is just some details that describe various forms of economic dependencies. We try to quantify what dependency theory suggests of, for example, unequal exchange in terms of wage and productivity relations between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, between Germany and Hungary, a dependence of international capital in the forms of loan, FDI, or EU transfers. Please don't forget that Hungary joined the European Union in 2004, so there was an increase in the share of European funds as a form of foreign capital entering into the country. And as I promised, also we can calculate this continuous deterioration of the terms of trades, not only as terms of trade in the interstate bilateral trade, but in the value-added form. So what's happening in these manufacturing value chains, and there these countries specialize, for example, in the automotive value chains. You see, it's a very lower end, and something like a bad terms of trade you see here because of the small and, in fact, decreasing share of domestic value added in that production. These are all illustrations, so we might come back to this, but I want to finish with the big story. So as I said, this model exhausted, in fact, the kind of a political regime, the power block of this neoliberal accumulation regime collapsed by 2010 for various internal and external reasons. It's, of course, the global crisis in 2008 and 9 that put the state and most social actors into the defense, into indebtedness, into a kind of a default by 2010. And what we see is that this is a moment when those fractions of the domestic capitalist classes attempted to reorganize. They entered into the state under the sort of management of the party Fidesz, led by Viktor Orban, and since then they reconfigure the state. They're reconfiguring the state both in its external integration, so they reconfigured their alliances with dominant capitalist classes, but also they reconfigured the power block inside of it. So what we see here is a massive centralizational effort of the state, which of course we can relate to these authoritarian tendencies, centralization of municipals. There is a new constitution, so it's a political centralization. But my argument is that this political centralization is in the service of a new power bloc that wants to make a new alliance between domestic capitalist classes and international capitalist classes. Please, next slide. I think I have to a little bit speed up my presentation, and unfortunately, I won't have time to go into every detail here, so let me just give a very brief overview, and we can discuss it maybe later in more details. So the forms of this new link between the external integration and the internal dynamics is at least twofold. I would highlight here two particular pillars of this accumulation regime. We call this accumulation regime as a new peripheral neo-mercantilist accumulation regime because it strengthens its relationship to the German industrial capital within the European Union. It's giving most favors to German industrial capital to use the country for production, for a kind of a neo-mercantilist types of export specialization. And the various policy terrains here that we highlight in the paper are education. So there's a training system modeled after the German industrial vocational system, the very regressive tax system, which gives large tax credits to international industrial capital, and various labor reforms, the last of which was implemented last year, which was named the slave law. It was actually drafted not only by the state, but the state invited international capital, mostly the German Industrial and Commerce Chamber, to draft the law. So it was, in fact, they drafted the labor law to help them, access labor. Actually, we have a short blog post focusing on the slave law with the same colleague of mine. If you're interested, I can share that paper in the blog. So this is one pillar, the peripheral neo-mercantilist integration into the German industrial capital, into their European networks. The other important pillar is that there is a support of the domestic capitalist classes in the form of subsidizing them in various public service industries. I think we can jump to the next slide. Yeah, we jumped a little ahead. Just to conclude about the second pillar. So these domestic classes are, of course, not in manufacturing. They're not competing with industrial capital. They're not producing exports. We call them that they are embedded and protected in non-tradable sectors. So in banking, in utilities, in media, in various services that the state has a control over. The state has a capacity to subsidize, and there they rechannel loads of funds to favor these domestic capitalist classes. Due to the neoliberal accumulation regime, some of these industries, so non-tradables, were still occupied by multinational companies. So what we see under Orban regime is on the one hand a very neoliberal friendly approach to the tradable sectors, to German industrial capital, and a very hostile approach to the non-tradable sectors with international capital in order to converse property relations for domestic capitalist classes, but only in the non-tradable sectors. The last aspect, which I still try to highlight, if I have a few more minutes, is that in its external relationship, it has developed, or as a legacy, there's been such a one-sided and strong dependence on Western capital, both in forms of Western loans, IMF loans, or German industrial capital, that since the crisis and since the decline or reconfiguration of these Western capitalist blocks, there is an attempt on behalf of the domestic capitalist class to realign itself with other international capitalist classes, to gain space with bargaining vis-a-vis international Western capital. So two major sources of international capital that enter into, then we see fractions aligning with local domestic capitalist classes come from Russia and China. So here it's a brief overview of how this, what I would call the decline of the previous hegemonic system and the multipolarization of this new geopolitical space helps domestic capitalist classes to reconfigure their relationship to international capitalist classes. Please, next slide. So in the remaining part, this is like, again, an empirical overview of how this linkage has been inserted, what type of capital relations we see arising between key Russian capitalist classes and the Hungarian state representing Hungarian domestic capital, and Chinese capital vis-a-vis again, regional capital. I will not be able really to go into all the details here. What we highlighted is that Russian capital seeking entrance into the EU for various reasons, mostly for geopolitical reasons, and they have certain spheres, mostly in energy, in nuclear energy as a form of technology, and also as state credit to provide domestic capitalist classes with their, very sufficient need for capital import. So we see a massive nuclear expansion in Hungarian production, financed by Russian capital and inserted by Rosatom, a Russian company. And we see various other transactions between energy companies, local energy companies and Russian energy companies. And we also see some infrastructural investments from Russia in Hungary in particular. Next slide, please. Again, this is a very interesting geopolitical repercussion of these new inter-capitalist class alliances. It's not only capital, it's not only economy, but there are a lot of geopolitical, stakes that come with this new alliance. It's very interesting how Kremlin Russia can use, for example, Hungarian media for Hungarian intelligence agencies to, in their endeavor in the European Union. I will not be able to go more into the detail here, but this is all I wanted to highlight. This is not only business, but it's a geopolitics with the business. Okay, next slide, please. Again, very, very briefly, this is the Chinese entrance into the region, which is a very global phenomena. It's not on the same scale as Russia. Russia is a more regional if you like, a post-Soviet focus. China has a more global focus, and we know that China might be the new hegemonic contender here, and they are very active in this multipolarization, or maybe in fact depolarization of the international hegemonic system. So they have this Belt and Road Initiative to both finance global infrastructure that they need for Chinese capital accumulation, but also to manage their own kind of a crisis of overaccumulation of domestic capital. So it's a manifold story, and I know China is probably even more active in Latin America than in Eastern Europe probably for geopolitical reasons, but what we might need to highlight here is that they're very active in Eastern Europe as well, and they build something like an alternative financial and infrastructural system to the existing neoliberal European system. So these are examples of what China does. In the infrastructure, they purchase ports in Europe, and they build a railway network to connect their ports, and one of the major cargo railway will pass through Eastern Europe. They're building the site between the Serbian capital Belgrade and Budapest. Again, this is financed by Chinese capital, Chinese banks. Next slide, please. It's a very short overview of the financial breakdown of the various Eastern European countries in relation to what sort of international capital they rely on, and what's the role of Chinese capital here. EU member states are still heavily relying on EU funds and EU loans. South and Southeastern European countries outside of the EU rely more on Chinese and Russian capital. So it's showing a kind of a geopolitical positioning of these countries in terms of their relationship to international capital. We also see a breakdown of the Chinese capital, what countries and what sort of a project it's targeting. And it's an empirical illustration. So please, next slide. that's not the infrastructural investment, but the kind of the financial tools that China is using. One of our good friends and colleagues here in the forum, Professor Bruno Di Conti, we know each other from discussions on the internationalization of the Chinese currency, which is again an interesting global phenomenon. I know Brazil or Argentina is very exposed to this. What is interesting that some of the countries in Eastern Europe are also exposed to this, and there are various initiatives between the Chinese central bank and local central banks to actually accumulate their reserves and broaden the scope of their transactions away from dollar and euros, so establish convertible major currencies to the Chinese currencies. Again, I will not go into the details of what it really brings about economically, but we can maybe discuss it later. So it's probably just time to conclude, as I'm running out of time here. What we see now, and let me refer back to the original concept of the dependency theory and the neo-Gramscian state and class theory, is that a new form of external integration that have brought about the reconfiguration of the internal forces in the form of a new power block. And this new form of external integration is, if you like, the product of the hegemonic shift from a transatlantic neoliberal, although already crisis-prone, Western-based hegemonic system to something like a more multipolar system. This is the kind of intersection that where we wanted to put the Orban regime, Hungary's new peripheral neo-mercantilist regime, and not only in its economic relations to European, particularly German industrial capital and new, mostly financial capital from China and Russia, but also how it's changing its maneuvering in the geopolitical, in the Euro-Asian geopolitical space, also in the EU, but with many other countries outside of the EU. So maybe in one sentence, the conclusion is that it's a new reconfiguration of semi-peripheral dependency. It's a new form of an accumulation regime in the semi-periphery, along these massive changes in the global structure. Thank you very much, and sorry for this very fast and kind of brief overview of otherwise long and massive stories. So again, I'm happy to share the blog post and the papers on this, and also to answer any of your questions.
Thanks so much, Tamás. It's so important, your presentation, that dialogues also with what Attila brings us in a very powerful way, so that we can better understand the current transformations on the historical issues on the formation of this, what you call the semi-peripheral state class, which I think is a very interesting thing for us to think also in Latin America. So to make this context on our region right now, and specifically in Brazil, I would like to invite and to welcome Professor Fábio Luiz Barbosa to start his presentation right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karina. Just make sure you hear me. Yes. Are you hearing me? Karina, okay. Thank you very much, Karina. Thank you, Bruno and Patricia, for putting me in touch with Karina and Danielle, Attila and Geröcs. I was very keen to know and to learn more about Hungary, and this is really a truly special opportunity for that. So I was contacted just 2 days ago, and I was given a huge, massive assignment, because I was supposed to talk in 15 minutes about those 3 issues that they have shared with you through the chat. So the approach that I've chosen is to make a kind of a broad overview of what's been going on in Latin America recently. and then in order to advance a few rather unorthodox hypotheses on the rise of the right in Latin America. So in the months before the pandemic, there was a lot going on in Latin America. There was insurrections in Chile and Ecuador. There were elections in Uruguay, Argentina, and Bolivia. There was an impeachment in Peru, and there were coup moves both in Bolivia and in Venezuela. And in Brazil, of course, we have seen Lula's release. So the question that I propose is there any common ground between all that's happening in these different countries? Is it possible to find a sort of a common thread between such diverse national process? So my hypothesis is that we are experiencing a worsening of the social crisis in Latin America. And this worsening finds political expression in an exhaustion of progressivism, of what has been called as the South American or the Latin American pink tide. And so an exhaustion of progressivism understood as a mode of regulation or as a way of managing the social tensions in the continent. And when I talk an exhaustion, it's both from above and from below, because progressivism was perceived differently. So from those from above, it was perceived as a means of crisis management. And from below, it was perceived as a civilizing alternative. So it's in crisis both from above and from below. So it's in this context that new forms of management of this pressure cooker called Latin America are being forged. So let's briefly recall what was the context where this the so-called pink tide emerged, where this progressive governments were elected, like between the election of Chavez in '98. Within the next 10 years, every South American country had governors, presidents identified with the left. So the context was basically a reaction to neoliberalism. And what was the common bet between this, the pink tide, between these progressive governments? It was social change without confronting the roots of the problems. That was the rule even when they reached the government amidst popular uprisings, as was the case in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Argentina. Their landscape was always conciliation and an attempt to improve the condition of those from below, either through cash transfer programs or a slight increase in the minimum wage. So, and meanwhile, business evolved as usual. So they were making their profits as usual. So how did this kind of management of social tensions have evolved? How did this progressive bet evolve in Latin America? We can say that at first it was pretty successful, to the extent that they were all these presidents were re-elected and or elected their successors, the only exception being Paraguay. However, if we look at the subcontinent now, what remains of progressivism faces a crossroads. So what has changed between the beginning of the 21st century and the most recent years? What has changed within these 15 years? I argue that there's been a conjunction of social, economic, and political factors. There is a common grammar, though, which can be summarized as saying that in the economy, there has been a worsening of the crisis, which has been expressed on recession and or inflation pressures in a context of the slowdown of the commodities super cycle, which has fueled all these cash transfer programs in every country in South America. So that's the economic. In the social sphere, the legitimacy of progressivism has been put in check as a consequence of the economic crisis and the rise of unemployment in particular. In the political realm, there was a growing malaise on the right due to the perpetuation of progressivism in power. The language of this malaise is denunciation of corruption scandals. Therefore, it has not been a programmatic reaction, a reaction compelled by a fundamentally different agenda. This reaction has, of course, been favored by the international context, an indication of which was the immediate recognition by the US and by most countries of the European Union of Guaido's in Venezuela last year, when he self-proclaimed as Venezuelan president. So this is an indication of this hostile international context, or hostile to progressivism. So this common grammar of political, economic, and social factors has a particular expression in each case. I will briefly examine two countries where progressivism has taken deeper roots, Venezuela and Bolivia. Why do I say they have taken deeper roots? Because in these two countries, constitutions were rewritten in the beginning of the 21st century with the idea of refounding their respective nations. Then I will move to Mexico and Brazil to analyze cases that might seem to deny the hypothesis that progressivism is at the end. So I will look at what remains of hope in progressivism, basically. So again, my argument is that in the crisis of progressivism, political, economic, and social aspects converge, albeit in different ways. So in Bolivia, the crisis exploded through politics. The current Bolivian situation is complex and is the subject of controversy on the left. I will just bring three important points to the table here. First, it is important to understand that the Bolivian situation is not simply a left against right dispute. At least since 2011, the popular base of the Morales government has been shattered. And the turning point here was the crackdown on the march against the construction of the highway in the Tipanis Indigenous Reserve. Second, the government reacted to these cracks on its base in an intolerant fashion, persecuting, defaming, and dividing critical organizations and leaders. At the same time, the Morales government has consolidated alliances with conservative political sectors, such as agribusiness and multinationals that exploit hydrocarbons and ores. So basically, no one upstairs was losing money in Morales, under Morales. In this process, MAS, which is the party that Morales belongs to, consolidated its power in the media, in the judiciary, in the police, and even in the relationship with the army, with the armed forces, through privileges such as keeping their pension system and also huge funds to buy army military equipment. So this power project, the Bolivian power project, focused more and more on the figure of Evo Morales himself. As the Vice President Garcia Linera used to say, it was Evism, the national popular in action. So that brings me to the third point. When allegations of fraud in the election exploded, let's remember that before going to the election, this last election in October 20 last year, Morales had been in charge for 3 mandates. And there was an attempt to reform the constitution in order to allow him to run for a 4th term. However, he was defeated by a narrow margin. Regardless of that, he insisted on running for a 4th term, arguing that it was a human right that was above the constitution of the country itself. So that when allegations of fraud, so then votes were being counted. The counting stopped for a while. At that point, Morales was not winning in the first round, because to win in the first round, he needed to have a 10% advantage against the second candidate. So he had like about an 8-7% advantage. Then there was an interruption in the count of votes. When the counting was resumed, he won by a very narrow margin. So at that point, allegations of fraud exploded. And then people took to the streets. And it was not only the right, although the right was also present, it was above all a youth for whom Morales and the MAS has always been the power, since they've been there for 15 years. So this popular reaction destabilized the government, creating a situation that the right wing since then has tried to take advantage of. So in short, in Bolivia, we have seen an attempt of progressivism to perpetuate itself in power despite the rules of the game which he himself had played until that point. We have seen progressivism as autocracy. In Venezuela, the source of the crisis is economic. Its roots refer to the limitations in breaking with the situation that Brazilian economist Celso Furtado described as underdevelopment with an abundance of foreign exchange. In other words, how to diversify an economy depending on oil exports, which results in a situation described by economists as a Dutch disease. The crisis was expressed basically through three key issues: inflation, exchange rate mismatches, and shortage of goods. In particular, the exchange rate disparity in an economy that imports everything it consumes was very critical because it has transformed an episodic situation in which many won a little money speculating in retail. For example, they would fill their tanks with very cheap Venezuelan gasoline, go across the border, sell them in Colombia, and have, a little profit in cash. So from this episodic situation where people could make little money speculating in retail, this has evolved to a situation where everyone needs dollars to defend their standard of living because of the currency mismatch. I don't have the time to go into the details, but just to tell you that, for example, when I was there in 2014, official rate was 1 for 7 bolivars. Black market was 1 for 70. There was already an important gap. 1 year later, when I was there again, it was 1 for 800 in the black market. So that basically meant that, for example, a toothpaste that was priced on 700 bolivars was less than $1 for those who could access dollars, but for those that could not, it was about $100. So that basically disorganized the Venezuelan economy. And that situation is the background of the erosion of Bolivarianism popularity. It is a reality in which work or the earnings of work is not enough for social reproduction. So this corrosion of the popularity, of the legitimacy of Bolivarianism was evident in the polls in December 2015, when the government suffered a dear defeat and was left with less than 1/3 of the parliamentarians. At that moment, Bolivarianism was faced with a crossroads: either to recognize defeat at the risk of the opposition using its majority to revoke Maduro's term, or to disdain the parliament and disdain the institutionality on which it had relied so far. We should remember that Bolivarianism under Chavez was probably a world record holder on elections. It has run 17 elections within 13 years, which it lost only 1. So the government opted the second way, a course that has divided the left between those who understand that the ends justify the means, as opposed to those who believe that the means have moved Bolivarianism away from any aspiration of change with which it originally identified itself. As one Venezuelan scholar says, the more Maduro stays in power, the less of Chavism will remain. So in this process, the government has radicalized its alliance with the military. The military currently command the vice presidency, several state governments, ministries, the state oil company, foreign trade, import and distribution of food, the purchase of arms, mining project, some sectors of smuggling, and the list goes on. Meanwhile, the country is sinking amidst a monumental social crisis, a humanitarian crisis, it can be argued, which is attested by the high rate of migration of people who has been living in Venezuela, as I could see, as I've been to the border with Brazil just a few months ago. So in Venezuela, a country where progressivism has taken deeper roots, we are witnessing progressivism as a disaster. So this picture could be expanded. For example, we could look in Nicaragua under Daniel Ortega, where we could see a progressivism as a tyranny. He basically runs the country as a tyranny together with his wife. But instead, I will look at the other side, what remains of hope in progressivism. That takes us to Mexico, where there's a case of what I would call as late progressivism, as López Obrador was elected in July 2018 as the president in Mexico. The question that arises then is whether this victory should be perceived as a triumph, as a victory of social change, or as an alternative to crisis management. On this, I make two observations. First, it should be noted that in every country where progressivism has not yet reached the presidency in South America, namely Peru, Bolivia, and Peru, Colombia, and Chile, left-wing fronts came second or third in the last elections, and in the most recent ones, in Mexico, López Obrador has won. So this is the first observation. Second, how deep is the Mexican crisis? How big are the problems faced by López Obrador? So to give you an idea, just picture all the problems that Brazil had in 2002 when Lula was first elected. Add to that a society and politics with a high level of penetration of organized crime, which Brazil did not have at that point. And finally, an official marriage with the United States, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement, the NAFTA. As López Obrador will not touch this last point, as he has made abundantly clear, it appears that the margin, the scope for significant change in the country is minimal. So what is envisioned in Mexico is a kind of counter dance with Brazil. While in Brazil, the new republic is threatened, and I'll come back to that later, in Mexico, it is the century-long pattern of one-party domination, which stems from the Mexican Revolution a century ago. This pattern of one-party domination has run out, demanding renovation. Since 2000, they have included a second party, other than the P, there's been the PRAN, but the PAN. But so it seems that it's this pattern that has exhausted, in opposition to Brazil, which is the new republic has exhausted itself. So I would say that late progressivism is not a card out of the deck from the perspective of politics from above, particularly in countries where it has not yet reached the presidency. However, its room of maneuver tends to decrease, as we'll certainly see in the case of Argentina, where progressivism has come back in the elections last year, albeit in the vice presidency. And why is that? Why do I say that the margin of maneuver tends to decrease? It is so because the historical trend points to different direction, as my previous colleagues have already mentioned. The Brazilian case illustrates that. So what's been happening in Brazil, if we have to summarize that, it can be said that the conjunction between the June 2013 rebellion, which was the largest mass demonstrations in the country's history, the conjunction of that, corruption scandals, and economic recession, economic crisis, which turned into a recession since 2015, the conjunction of these three aspects has produced a shift in the approach of the ruling class. This shift can be summarized within two ideas: a shift from inclusive neoliberalism, preached by the PT, to social dispossession, a shift from class conciliation to class confrontation. I argue that this is the background of the PT's defenestration from Brasilia, between Rousseff's impeachment and Lula's arrest. So beyond the political personages, this is the wider framework. I would say that the Lulista way of regulating social conflict has run out. And that's what the ruling class has perceived in June 2013. So, but that's not all. From the point of view of order, I believe that it is, and that's not only me, many people argue that, it is the new republic itself that has run out. What am I calling the new republic? It's basically the framework that has of social and capital reproduction that followed the end of dictatorship in the 80s in Brazil, which has as its founding stone the so-called citizens' constitution. So this is threatened. I believe that what the Brazilian bourgeoisie is contriving is the political and institutional arrangement that will succeed the new republic, which is definitively condemned. That implies that the time of the PT have passed, but also the time of the Tucans. The Tucans are the party of Cardoso, which came before Lula, the two parties that have polarized politics in Brazil along the past 3 decades. So in this sense, Brazil is at the political forefront of the continent. Bolsonaro and Paulo Guedes, his economy minister, are in tune with the world moving right. And what is the hallmark of this trend? It is to respond to the crisis, economic, political, ecological crisis, by stepping up on the accelerator of history, on the path that leads us to social disintegration, or to barbarism, if you want to put it short. So while progressives, let's say the European social democracy, American Democrats, or the progressives in Latin America try to contain the crisis, to curb this crisis, this new right tries to step up on the accelerator. However, nobody seems to question the track itself. So I say that Brazil is at the forefront because here the process of sterilizing progressivism and deconstructing this institutional framework on which progressivism was based in Brazil, this process is more advanced. It's more advanced compared, for example, with Argentina or Uruguay. In Argentina, progressivism lost the elections in 2015. They played a responsible opposition for 4 years, and now they're back, albeit in the vice presidency. So in Uruguay, they lost the elections last year. They're playing the same game, expecting to come back to the presidency in the next elections. By the way, this is the expectation of the Worker Party of Lula himself. That's why they resisted to taking a stand for the impeachment of Bolsonaro, despite the potentially genocide politics that Bolsonaro was playing and was preaching along the pandemic crisis in Brazil. So to conclude, I argue that the setback of progressivism, of the pink tide, as well as the rise of the extreme right in the subcontinent, cannot be credited to the account of the usual enemies, the US government, the elites, the manipulation of the media, fake news, and so on. My hypothesis is that progressivism has engendered what can be called a provisional containment of a social breakdown. But through this provisional containment of social breakdown, it has reinforced past structures and has not projected a different future. This is clear, for example, to give just one example in the economy, as extractivism or accumulation by dispossession was enforced all over the subcontinent in the past years, to an extent that the Argentinian sociologist Maristela Svampa talks of a commodities consensus. So extractivism has been reinforced as opposed, for example, to industrialization. So the fundamental issue here is that the means with which one can try to contain the social collapse in the present, these means are at the same time accelerators of this very same collapse. In other words, despite the good intentions of progressive leaders, despite the good intentions of the pink tide, the management of the dismantling of wage citizenship today implies practices that accelerate this disruptive social dynamics. In short, there is a dynamics that I would describe as accelerating containing dynamics, which is a paradox, obviously. I don't have the time to go into detail on that. I could also send you to my own work, my own papers on that. I would just to give you a sense of what I mean, I will briefly give you 3 quick examples on Brazil. So if we remember that Lula sent the military to lead United Nations in Haiti, he sent them to Haiti with the idea of making Brazil a global player. Well, this very same military came back to Brazil to play a role in this intervention in the slums, in the favelas in Brazil, throughout the World Cup, throughout the Olympic Games. And well, anyway, this military now, they're filling the first post, the most important, the top posts in Brasilia under Bolsonaro. Second, the head of the coup against Rousseff, we should remember, Temer, he was elected twice as the vice president. So he was brought to fame, so to say, or to the forefront of the politics in Brazil by the Workers' Party itself, and then he became one of the leaders of the conspirators for the coup. A third last example, the evangelicals that now make the core of Bolsonaro's constituency once supported Lula and the PT. So basically, the military, Temer and the PMDB, which is his party, the evangelicals, they had always been there. They had at some point they were cultivated and fostered by the PT's government, and now, well, they seem to be running the show. So if we analyze the demise of progressivism from within, we can understand why the convergence between neoliberalism and authoritarianism goes across the region. And it's not limited to governments like Bolsonaro, Duque in Colombia, or Piñera in Chile. Also in different ways. It's obvious, I'm not saying that Venezuela is the same process that in Brazil, but what I'm saying is that if you look in Venezuela and if you look in Bolivia, we're also going to see anti-democratic trends in these situations, as well as in Nicaragua, wherever we look. So my point is, and even if we look at Mexico, where López Obrador is having a hard time and he's stepping back on dismantling the repressive devices of the war on drugs that the previous governments have implemented. So my point is that the corrosion of the social fabric is universal, and progressivism has corroborated it, albeit even if unwittingly. I'm not saying that they intended to. What I'm saying is that the dynamics through which they try to contain, at the same time they have accelerated this degradation. So furthermore, therefore, if we approach the demise of the pink tide from within, we can understand why in Latin America there has been room for right-wing politicians who no longer mobilize the promise to mitigate and contain social collapse, but exactly on the contrary, they govern in the name and through the acceleration of this process. So by giving expression to the social resentment that necessarily comes from the permanent crisis, this new right claims a perverse but real authenticity. They claim themselves to be the real thing. They're saying this is a world of war of all against all, and this world is not rosy. So we have to arm ourselves and we have to go out for a fight. This is so with that rhetoric, they claim and they appear themselves as being genuine. What my point here is that this is not ideology.
Professor Fábio,
Oi.
We are, if you want to come to your conclusions, so a couple of minutes for you to talk,
okay.
and
I'm done.
Then we come back with the other teachers. So if you want to make your conclusions, okay?
No, this is okay. So I can stop here. So my point is that this right does not propose to remedy frustration or manage the crisis, but basically it proposes itself to govern through the crisis.
Okay, so thank you so much for your presentation. There were amazing considerations for us to do. And so we have some questions from the audience that we'd like to ask for Geröcs and also Attila. Karina can introduce those questions. Fala para aqui.
I'll try to speak this. Yes, so we have already 2 hours, and I know that in Budapest, where Attila is, it's quite late. So I think we will try to make like 5 minutes so that Attila can present those last slides, which we were very interested, and ask the 3 speakers to pay attention on the questions that are on the chat. There are questions to Attila, to Tamás, and to Fábio. So I will open the space for Attila to answering this. And let's put off the microphones, please.
I hear you. Can you hear me? Tamás is first. Then I try. So is using the pandemic to own power and to implement authoritarian government. It's a and then the answer is once again, Bruno, sorry, not Fábio, you made a very important point, and this is the following: that these new authoritarian governments, they love one situation. Then there is the feeling of a war against hitting everybody. So war is going on among everybody. And that, I think, is a very important point. And this is what this pandemic allows, once again, to people like Viktor Orban. Because, once again, just a second, the camera disappeared from my computer. I don't know why. I didn't do anything. Just a second. Let me put that back. Okay. So the point is, this computer is, sorry, it's not very good. Okay. So the point is that right now, Viktor Orban can use all kinds of arguments against the opposition and can increase its authoritarian grip. It also introduced new specific laws concerning the pandemic without any deadline. This is very important, although this has been misinterpreted in the liberal press in a lot of ways. Because the liberal press said that from now on, everything is governed in Hungary through decrees. But this is not true. The big problem is the following, that he controls, the parliament is going on, but he controls the parliament completely. So basically, Viktor Orban now can make a decision in the following way. Do I do a decree related to the pandemic within 2 hours, or I have to wait 2 weeks while it goes through the parliament? That's basically the thing. And then the media is very much controlled, and then the communication is very much ruled in a hegemonic way. So I think the answer to this question by Patricia and Bruno is a definite yes. And one more thing. In case I am right, that health and social security is going to be the big terrain of fight globally and also locally, the pandemic is a fantastic opportunity. Because here, the classic question of Foucault comes. Whom to support, whom not to support. And this kind of a fight is a paradise for authoritarian governments, because there's no problem pointing out enemies who are creating the pandemic or enemies who are taking away resources from us. And these two questions are going to preoccupy politicians, and this is how they're trying to do political discourses. Karina, you also mentioned that I should show the last 2 slides. Have I understood you correctly? Because then go into that? Yes.
That's perfect, Attila. And also there is a question from Danilo. I don't know if you have seen.
Yes, about Agnes Helge.
Yes.
I think it's a very good question, and actually, I would be very happy to listen to Tamás and then to Fábio as well concerning this question, because that is a central question. Namely that whether class interest is completely disappearing, or and now we just see ideologies. Therefore, we have to talk about pyramids. I hope I understood the question correctly. Right? Now, my answer to this is two questions. One is that that now in these archetype societies of people is hidden, because everybody find a way and maneuver in this global market, and as they don't see the opportunity, the old market scenario, they to subordinate there is in the hope of some social maneuvering. About what Fábio was talking about, that a lot of progressivists are just trying to do some social democratic things to the masses instead of telling them what is the way out of the system. And I think the global market is doing very well, and then the big masses, not us, but the big masses, they don't see any new model which might allow them to formulate their class interest. Class interest is not something of just an idea of the culture as well. So what do I need for my social stability? Yes, I think I don't agree with Agnes Helge. I think the most important problem is that we have no future vision how to overcome things, and this is why masses are not able to formulate their own interests and then to articulate them. I might be wrong. Now, then these last two slides, and let me just once again explain. So this is about Brazil. I did this morning just for you. So this is Brazil, and then you can see once again the problem of demographic change, old age dependency. The blue line, it goes very straight here, like this. This is old age dependency, right? Now the next thing, which is very important, is the tax percentage, right? So why, social composition is changing. How does this? Now this is, this is the, these are the Lula governments, and the Labour governments, or the Workers' Party governments, right? State registration goes down. And here we come to this new scenario. This is what Capital wanted from Bolsonaro as well in a lot of ways, and then to do this, to finish this kind of too much state redistribution, right? And then, as you can see, on the basis of World Bank data I am working with, you can see it's going down. At the same time, you can also see that this globalization, which was going on, so more and more export-oriented economy, this actually also stopped. And then the other thing which I want to say, so here emerging, right? That is to say, state administration going up and going down. I think this is one of the reasons why people are afraid, because they just don't know what their elderly life or And then you can see the other thing, which I already explained to you, is the labor conflict situation, where you can see once again, this was, the period of, some progressive change in Brazil. Then you can see it all went positive. So the green shows you whether there is an increase or a decrease of a labor force participation rate, and whether the structural change is really harming primary jobs or not. And then you can see that it was not. Now you can see that here it has got all very negative during the 2010s, right? In that sense. And then once again, the other big story is, of course, what to do with the foreign direct investment. There you can see this is, how it started, the story in the 1990s, and then it went down a little bit, but once again it's going up. So we have a very conflictuous situation in Brazil, in case we look at this macro data. Labor tension is going up, foreign direct investment is going up, state redistribution is going down, but demographic and social problems are going up. How to solve it? We don't know, but this is, I think, something we can very nicely see. Now let's go to the Hungarian story for a second. Where is the, yes, here is the Hungarian story. It's actually a little bit different story, although it's very, very interesting in a lot of ways as well. First of all, in case you recall, this is, old age dependency in Hungary. Right? Why Hungary is not showing such a sharp increase is because it started having low fertility very early. In the 1950s and the 1960s already it was very low. So we started aging at a long time ago, which means that we are a much higher level than Brazil in this respect. And then you can see in the late socialist period it improved a little bit due to a little bit higher fertility in the 70s and then in the late 60s. And then you can see aging is going up. Now here comes the other story, which is, redistribution levels. And actually, it's very nice. You can see that the two graphs are going together. Whatever we think about Eastern Europe, we have to be aware of one thing. Due to the history of state socialism, global capital could not do as much as they wanted to do in Eastern Europe, which meant that redistribution levels did not go really down. But as I told you, Orbán has made a long-term promise, even to local capital, that he would reduce state redistribution in certain sectors, reducing public employees. My university is privatized, so I am not anymore a public employee. And they are doing this everywhere where they can do it, which means that they are trying to reduce redistribution in order to have less of so more income remaining privately. Also, very importantly, Orbán is very famous about lowering corporate tax, lowering income tax, that is to say, in that sense, increasing social inequality within the country. One more thing which I wanted to mention as well is that these countries like Hungary are super globalized. This is export ratio to GDP. This is a different scale, so you should look at the scale now here, and then you can see that actually we almost reached 100%. Brazil was never even close to that. 100%, meaning that sorry, my camera is once again gone. It's horrendous. Sorry. Can you see me now? I hope. Okay. Once again, I'm just. Okay, it kicks me out all the time from the camera. So the Hungarian story is somewhat similar. We are in a very dubious position today. The big difference is here that the labor market has improved under the Orbán regime rather dramatically. So this is why this conflict around state redistribution is not really coming up. So that was, I think, the miracle of the Orban. So the Orban authoritarian regime concerning the labor market has been working differently. Although we have to make clear that this improvement in the labor market was achieved via a complete flexibilization of the labor force, right? Which means that they could be able to do that. So there are a lot of similarities, but a lot of differences concerning this new scenario. But my point is, globally and also locally, these 2010s, I mean, this period in global history is something of a new era, dramatic conflict, which is feeding such authoritarianism which we have expected.
Thanks a lot, Attila. I think now we can welcome Tamás.
Yes, thank you for the many questions. I try to be brief and integrate as many of the questions as possible into a short 5-minute discussion. I would go back to this notion of Agnes Heller and whether these new authoritarian regimes or regimes of accumulation, as I call them, with their specifically reconfigured power blocks and are not more based on class or class relations, but are more like ideological construct based on ideological constructs. And I don't fully agree with that. So I think there is a very strong class dimension here remain, which we should still understand. The way I try to portray it, and let me elaborate on some of the aspects here relating on the questions, that there's of course a novelty in the situation from the previous crisis in 2010 up until to the most recent crisis. We can speculate about the directions of it. So the novelty, I would say, is this reconfigurations of the power block and challenges of the power block, whether it's able to sustain and reproduce its social basis and its, if you like, its bourgeois projects of accumulation. So continue with the accumulation. What is, though, not necessarily a novelty, but a long history of capitalist crisis from. In my speech, it went back as far as the 1970s, but of course it goes much further back, is that there is an acceleration of processes here. And I would say even the pandemic has escalated some of the processes that have been around so far, both in the economy and both in the social relations. Just as an example, think to, for example, the acceleration of the digitalization we are experiencing right now, what effect it's going to have on education, on even on production. These processes have been around, but they seem to accelerate and probably change many of the relations that has been these hegemonic regimes have comprised of, whether it's the inter-capitalist relations in the power block or even capital-labor relations. So I think the pandemic accelerates actually the antagonisms here, and that actually poses a lot of challenges for capital as well. So let me be a little bit more concrete historically, and going back to Hungary, what it seems to bring about this, if you like, this pandemic, or the more deeper rooted contradictions of capitalisms that's coming really fast onto the fore. I would call it something like, and that's again a very broad concept here, as a further centralization of capital and the further monopolization of capital that's been transformed much of the 20th century and seems to go deeper today due to the pandemic. And that poses a major challenge to this otherwise very fragile relationship between the various capitalist fractions in those power blocks that's been formed since 2010 in Hungary in particular, which I call this semi-peripheral neo-mercantilist regime. So the challenge here is, of course, that what kind of a new sort of, if you like, competition arises in the economy for bigger capital to capture smaller capital in the centralization and monopolization process, how it's going to let international capital to penetrate in some of the spheres of the economy, and what kind of reactionary, in part defensive response domestic capitalist classes will have to react to that. So we might expect a new sort of reconfiguration, or a new sort of a balance of forces between the major capitalist fractions under the pressure of the crisis, under the pressure of capital concentration, I would call it at this stage. So this is a strong class dimension, but what might need to be emphasized here still is that the power block is not only based on the capitalist fractions, but of course dominated classes play a very important role here, and labor and fractions of the working class is very important as well, and we have to see how they are incorporated into this changing hegemony. And I'm still using this very general Gramscian terminology here. It's always through consent and coercion, and this is where really ideology comes into a very it comes into the picture and plays a very important part. How the working class is actually divided and fragmented by ideological means, and how there is an attempt to build some form of a consent around ideological concepts. That's part of these divisions, and how under the growing pressure of capital monopolization and concentration, there is a shift towards more coercive means. So what we see, for example, in Hungary, since the last couple of months, for example, with the emergency rule, if you like, is that going more into this direction of using more direct coercive means to keep this hegemonic system under pressure together. If you like to run ahead in time in a somewhat almost like a defensive response to a more global reconfiguration of the various capitalist classes, to save the kind of a balance of forces that's been built up and consolidated to some degree in the last couple of years, and which again come under a much pressure. One more aspect that I wanted to a little bit highlight here, and I thank to Zoltán for his questions, which is of course very valid and this very limited scope of discussion. I couldn't go into many of the very important aspects of how domestic capital has been attempting to reproduce itself, and what the relationship of those state policies, if you like, constitutional framework, and this domestic capitalist crisis, a kind of a bourgeoisie to, you know, function in the power block, or the new power block to be centered around this kind of a domestic bourgeois class. And one thing that's important here to analyze is that despite the fact they have some sort of a inferior position, or a kind of a subjugated bargaining position vis-a-vis major international capitalist classes, and they try to use the state to protect themselves and even to get some subsidies for the sake of their reproduction, there is also a large pressure on them, and some of the pressure comes actually from the state to internationalize in spheres and segments of the world economy where they have, well, geopolitical space to do so. And here it's usually this question is importantly not only east-west or core semi-peripheral relational question, but we see the attempt of domestic capitalist classes in the semi-periphery to internationalize towards the periphery and to somewhat colonize the periphery in a sometimes even more brutal fashion, as they were subjugated and colonized by international capital. So the full picture is not only an east-west or a core semi-periphery, but it's a much more complex situation. This has been always the case. We see it even in state socialism, where, of course, it's a little bit difficult to talk about capital, as it was not functioning in the form of private capital, but most like a state bureaucratic capital forms. But we still had large corporations competing in international markets and using geopolitical space to enter, for example, post-colonial areas in the Cold War. So that was a very similar attempt for them to stabilize their position internationally. And as Zoltán probably knows it even better than I do, because that's his research, as far as I know, is that it's a very strong situation today in terms of the Hungarian domestic capitalist classes that do try. There's a visible attempt for them to internationalize into economies which are in a much more dependent peripheral position within the world economy, particularly in Africa, in parts of Southeast Asia. And as I said, they use the geopolitical space here, so it's often that they go with their new global class alliances. They can put into joint projects, for example, with Russian capital or maybe with Chinese capital as suppliers or junior partners in their new colonization or new scramble, or you name it how you want to call it, of their attempts to internationalize, like in the case of Chinese capital. We don't see it as of yet in today's Hungarian domestic capitalist classes, but again, if you go back in time, you see that in the Cold War context, it was, of course, large joint ventures and joint projects even with Western capital, sometimes with Russian capital, sometimes to enter into, for example, Africa. So this is a very important question. And he also mentioned this, like, we should elaborate more on, even on the theoretical level, of to distinguish between the semi-periphery and the periphery. And of course, there's a large literature on that. I don't want to go into very details here. Maybe one of the aspects I would highlight, because that relates the most to my analysis, is the kind of a position and, if you like, the strength of the local capitalist classes vis-a-vis international capital. So in the semi-periphery, you see this very fragmented and fragile power block, which is a contestation between major fractions of the international capitalist classes and the local fractions of domestic capitalist classes. This kind of a balance of forces are usually very different in post-colonial, neo-colonized peripheral economies, where I know it's somewhat schematic to say, but there are sometimes no domestic capitalist classes. It's fully comprador situation. It's a full subjugation from international capital, and in some cases you might have some bureaucratic oligarchic intermediary groups in the state, but as of domestic classes are not only weak and subjugated, but largely missing in the peripheral situation. So that's a major theoretical distinction between the semi-periphery and the periphery in my understanding.
Thanks a lot, Tamás. So I'll ask Fábio for like 5 minutes if you can, and then we will try to make a picture with all the cams open with the audience.
Okay. Thank you very much again, Attila, also for the question. Geröcs, I'm really happy with this interaction. So how does Bolsonaro get the adhesion of those from below? So first, it's important to know that he conceals his agenda from his constituency. It's important to remark that politics of hate is also politics of diversion. So while talking about other things, so research among Bolsonaro voters shows, for example, that that most of them were against the pension system reform, which was his main agenda, but he concealed that because it was not in discussion on the electoral campaign. It also should be said that he communicates with people, although in a perverse way. Lula also communicates with people, but in a very kind, hopeful way. Bolsonaro does that in a very brutal way, which a brutalized people actually understands. So he's seen as genuine, as the real thing. So particularly among the youth. So in Brazil, he's known as the myth, because he is supposedly like he's seen as somebody that dares to say things that others do not. So as I was trying to argue in my presentation, he presents a picture of the world, a very simple picture, but that resonates with people's reality. He shows the crudity of it, and he says he's going to play along those rules. He's not promising rosy alternatives, which are mostly broken promises again and again. And that's how, so it actually happened that Bolsonaro was able to portray himself as an outsider in these elections, despite the fact that he had been an MP, a deputy for like over 30 years, 7 mandates. So he was basically a professional politician, but he portrayed himself because he's genuine, because he says things that others don't, because he's funny, and so forth. He was perceived, it was a vote against the establishment for many. Of course, there was also those that voted on Bolsonaro because they pretty much agree with his right-wing agenda. But I would say that this was a minority of votes, which also, by the way, gives us hope. I understand that Bolsonaro has not won hearts and minds of people, as opposed to with what happens in India, for example, with Modi and the Hindu nationalism, which is a much more entrenched phenomena in society. In India, hearts and minds are with Hindu nationalists. That's not the case in Brazil, I believe. A last point to illustrate what I'm saying is that his perverse politics, they do have an audience. So the politics that he's playing in the Corona crisis, what is basically, he has a calculus. Basically, his calculus is the crisis is going to have two consequences: the sanitary dimension, but also the economic dimension. He's playing the card that the economic dimension is going to be most felt by the poor people, as opposed to the sanitary crisis. So when he says that vertical isolation has to be put in place, that people has to work, he's talking to people that is not dying because of the coronavirus, but they're dying because they cannot eat in the circumstances. We should always remember how poor and how unequal Brazilian society is. So to give you an example, a sample, I do every week, I go to street vendors that come here close to my street to buy vegetable fruits and and other stuff. So I talk to them and I listen. And what are they saying? They are with Bolsonaro. They are precisely because of that. Because they say we are healthy, we are young, we should work, and and through that we can also help keep the elderly ones that should not work and so forth. So he talks to people. And last point, last week, just 2 weeks ago, he decided to implement a sort of a emergency cash transfer program, which pays 4 times more than the Bolsa Familia program, which was like the great program that the PT has portrayed. So it pays 4 times more and to 4 times more people. So what I'm just trying to suggest here is that he's also, this is a major break with the economics that he's been playing so far, which was basically Chilean brand of fundamental neoliberalism. So Brazilian politics, people might be bored elsewhere, but in Brazil things are moving pretty fast. So it appears that very recently Bolsonaro is attempting to to build his allegiance with the popular workers, also through an expansion of these kind of cash transfer programs, which is a shift from the politics that he has been played, the kind of crude neoliberal which has been implemented until then. And just one clarification: the labor reform was implemented before Bolsonaro. That was very. You're very right. It has a devastating effect on this on the worker Brazilian labor conditions, but it has been implemented by Temer, which was between Lula or between Rousseff and Bolsonaro. So the effects are being felt, and Bolsonaro plays with these effects. That's basically what I'm trying to argue. If you're interested, I'm writing 2 pages in English about that. I can share with you with great pleasure within a few days.
Oh, that's okay. So I would like to thank all the speakers that attended our invitation, and we really would like to keep this dialogue and keep exchanging papers and ideas and actions. Let me just silence.
Okay.
And for sure, we would need like days to really understand all the specificities of each context we were trying to explore. But I really believe that what we could do today was really important to analyze the origins and the impacts of the global crisis, amplified by the pandemic we are living right now, this really challenge, and the specificities we are living on these regions where the capitalism is even brutal, is bárbaro. I don't know which is the translation. Bárbaro. I don't know which is the translation for barbaridade. Una barbaridade. What we feel, right? But that's what we feel, right? I think we are feeling on our skins the violence of this oppression, and we have a huge task as students, as professors, as academics. So I think if we can keep in touch and use all the tools we have right now to keep on the connection with international people that are also interested and are also paying attention to these new formations on the capitalist classes that are on power, and so we can better analyze it to better have our strategies, right? So I don't know if Junior, do you want to come to the microphone or say something? If you agree. I don't know if everybody has a camera, but I would like to invite our participants that are still brave with us to come to the camera so we can make a picture to register our International Workers' Day and to sharing solidarity with the workers and also with the groups we are in touch. Patricia and Bruno, so good to see you. Thanks for all the support. And also, hi for Javi. Javi is the baby.
He's sleeping now. You're lucky.
Good. So somebody can relax. Nice, Vera and Junior, very important friends. If you want to turn in the mic just to say hello, it's free choice. I have a sign. I don't know if you have some symbol like around. I put mine one. And then we can try to make the picture. Let me. Okay, Bruno is going to pick something. Ah, nice. Good. So who takes the picture? I'll try with my cell phone. Someone else wants to come in? Okay, good. I'll try this. Okay. International solidarity. Woo.
Thanks a lot, everybody. I would like to thank also Pedro Bello, who's broadcasting the live video through Facebook. So thanks a lot, Pedro Bello, and thanks to all the participants too.
Pode colocar música da Internacional. We will try to put a special song to finish. Attila, what time is it now in Budapest? Turn on your mic.
Yeah, no. Just a second. You have a microphone, we got one speaker fence. No, it's in board, but
here we go for the last performance.
Arriba los pobres del mundo, de pie los esclavos sin pan, y gritemos todos unidos, viva la internacional, removamos todas las trabas que nos impiden nuestro bien. Al mundo de fases, hundiendo al imperio burgués.
El día que el triunfo alcancemos, ni esclavos ni hambrientos habrá. La tierra será el paraíso de toda la humanidad. Que la tierra de todos sus frutos y la dicha que abajo es el sostén de todos. Que la abundancia hará gozar. Agrupémonos todos en la lucha final y se alcen los pueblos con valor por la internacional.
Okay, so anyone wants to say something to finish?
No, I'm just happy May Day to everybody.
Yes. Happy Workers' Day.
Thank you.
Let's strengthen and let's keep together.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks to the International Fontié Kwze Forum. Goodbye to everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, Junior. Bye, Patrícia, Bruno. Bye, Professor Fábio, Professor Attila. Bye, Vera.
Thank you so much.
It was great.
Thanks, Attila.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Attila, very good to see you. Thank you so much. Really great.
Não, pode ligar. Vamos.